All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Action Core War Powers panel. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. A little bit about me. My name is Kanisha. I'm a current organizer with Action Core out of Maryland. I originally got involved after I had been seeing images and videos of Palestinian children all over my Instagram feed. I knew that I wanted to do something, but I didn't know what I could do. I didn't know that I could have an impact. So one day I was talking with one of my colleagues in the office who had previously organized with Action Corps during his undergrad, and he told me about the organization and told me about advocacy and just advocating for policies that protect the lives and humanity of everyone, both domestic and abroad. So I immediately knew this was something I wanted to get involved with. I knew that it was the opportunity for me to do something about issues that were passionate for me. So I went ahead and I submitted an application to be an organizer with Action Corps, and so now I'm here today. And since then, I've been able to participate in all kinds of advocacy campaigns. I've been able to do, for example, a sign-on campaign for a joint resolution of disapproval that was opposing an additional weapons sale to Israel. And we're actually able to get our Maryland Senator Van Hollen to sign on to that. So we had some really interesting wins, and it was just really awesome seeing our community come together and rally about issues that just preserve human life all over the world. So if we could go ahead and get some introductions from you guys real quick up in the chat. If you could just say your name, the state or country where you're from, and then just a greeting in the chat, that'd be awesome. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. As you are introducing yourself in the chat, just a note that this call is being recorded. So if you do not want your name to be included in this recording, which we will put up on YouTube, you're welcome to change your name in the little upper right-hand corner of your tile, your little square. You can click to rename yourself. You're also welcome to minimize your screen. Or to hide your video. But it will when there's one person speaking, that's what will be shown on YouTube. So you don't have to. Mostly your faces will not be shown anyway. All right. So I want to maybe we can hide the screen. Great. Um, I want to read you a quote, and I'm interested in your guesses as to who said this. And I encourage you to put your guesses in the chat. If you actually know who said this quote, you heard it or you read it, you can hold back. The gleaming marvels of Riyadh and Abu Dhabi were not created by the so-called nation builders, neocons, or liberal nonprofits like those who spent trillions failing to develop Kabul, Baghdad, so many other cities. In the end, the so-called nation builders wrecked far more nations than they built, and the interventionists were intervening in complex societies that they did not even understand themselves.
Wow.
So, who do you think said that? Henry Kissinger, good guess. Um, Anybody know who said this? Yeah, Dr. Sheline.
Trump said that just today, addressing the audience in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia.
Wow.
And he said this after being responsible for committing over 1,000 airstrikes in Yemen, over 1,000 airstrikes since March 15th of this year. So, within that same speech, he said, he defended those bombings. So he had, you see this tension in, I believe, in the United States among the American people and within the administration and within the president himself over whether the priority is asserting U.S. domination or whether the priority is respecting the Constitution, the rule of law, and humanity. So the reason I wanted to share that quote is to show that we are in a moment where there is tension within the administration about what direction to go. And you could even see that with starting these in the signal chat that was about the bombings, the disagreement. And you can see that with the White House starting this bombing campaign and then just recently stopping it. We have a critical role to play at this moment. And if there's one thing that you get from our call tonight, I hope it's that you see that you are not alone and that you probably have more power than you realize. Action Corps was able to bring people together in 2017, 2018, 2019, and helped get a resolution, Yemen war powers resolution through a divided Congress to the president's desk. It was historic. Many of you were involved with that. I haven't seen Congress at any point vote to authorize war on Yemen in the last 10 years that the United States, through Israel, through Saudi Arabia, and most in the last year or so, just directly, has waged war in Yemen. But not once did Congress actually authorize this. And that resolution was significant in getting to the president's desk through a divided Congress. Rarely have we seen progressive legislation or legislation that actually brought together both progressive humanitarians, human rights advocates, and constitutional conservatives through a divided Congress and getting it to the president's desk. And so one of the things that I'm really excited about here is that we have people from across the United States and perhaps beyond. You have better sense because you had a chance to read the chat here of where people are from. We have people from all over, and we also have people from across the spectrum ideologically. We have people on this call who have voted for different candidates last fall, probably more than just two different candidates. There's probably quite a range. And we also have people who just come at this from very different perspectives. And that's what excites me because we're not going to win alone. We're not going to stop these ridiculous, horrendous wars just within our group of politically like-minded people. We're going to win when we build coalitions, when we build bridges, when we build that momentum that actually can't be stopped. Because when you have people across the political spectrum who are saying we must protect the Constitution, that has been a winning argument. We have seen the success of that. And I'm looking forward to winning with all of you again. So with that, I'm going to give you a quick preview. We're going to hear from three people I'm really excited about. Do you want to bring up, Brian, bring up the agenda? Great. We're going to hear from Dr. Annelle Sheline about the humanitarian impact, the human impact of U.S. aggression, particularly in Yemen, but we can also talk about Gaza and what the U.S. role has been. I saw that Bruce Fein just joined in. Bruce is, I'm really excited to have you here, Bruce. This idea of this panel came out of a conversation that Bruce and I were having following one with another longtime Yemen war powers advocate. And then we'll be talking about building local power and hearing from Diego on that. We'll have some Q&A. I've looked through the questions that many of you submitted. Thank you for those. We'll then take a moment for action so that you can all have left, not just hopefully learn something, but having done something that you can then share with other people. We'll have a little more discussion. And then for folks who are up for staying on for a minute, we'll do a screenshot which we can share out tomorrow with some messaging about ending endless war and calling on Congress to do its part. So I'll now introduce briefly the speakers. And first we're going to, we changed the agenda a little bit. Bruce, we're going to have, if it's okay with you, Annelle, we'll have you speak first. Dr. Annelle Sheline was a State Department official. We actually got to work with Annelle prior to her joining the State Department on about Yemen and stopping U.S. participation in the war. She moved many of us. I was deeply inspired by her decision to quit the State Department over Gaza and the complicity of the United States in the genocide. She's a researcher at the Quincy Institute, and so glad to have you, Annelle. And then we'll hear from Bruce Fein. who is an attorney, constitutional attorney. He's a former Associate Deputy Attorney General of the United States. And at one point, he was shortlisted for U.S. Supreme Court. Honored to have you with us. I'm excited to read your books that I just found out about. Diego Rivera is an Iraq war veteran. He's now at the organization Bring Our Troops Home. He's the field director there. He's mobilizing veterans and other Americans to end war and specifically to protect members of the National Guard from being deployed without a declaration of war. With that, we're gonna turn the mic over to Dr. Annelle Sheline. Annelle, if you're ready to start us off.
Yeah, Isaac, thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to get to speak with you all. I wanted to highlight something that Kanisha said in sort of these images of children in Gaza, or images of so many people suffering in Gaza, which was a big part of why I chose to resign publicly from the State Department. And to highlight that, unfortunately, I mean, obviously the horrors of Gaza continue unabated. And Yemen is in many ways on an even larger scale in terms of the numbers of people affected, and it does get much less attention. And I do not want to in any way diminish what's happening in Gaza in many ways, because that is on such another level of the violations of U.S. law, of international law. I do think this is a huge, huge moral failing, not only obviously on the part of our country, but many other countries as well that are allowing sort of the this sort of gaping wound in humanity to go on kind of on all of our smartphones all day. Whereas Yemen is a conflict that has been going on for quite a long time. In particular, just some background on Yemen, the sort of situation in Yemen was the result of an Arab Spring transition that went poorly. The Houthis took over in 2014. In 2015, a Saudi-led coalition launched this war on Yemen, aided by the United States, to try to oust the Houthis. And I can drop in the chat some research I did on that at the time, which was kind of looking in particular on the way that the US was complicit, but not so directly involved in what was happening in Yemen. And this was interesting in terms of the war powers work that I contributed to, although was not yet working on this when that war powers resolution was passed. And Isaac and others did so much important work on that. But what's interesting is that at the time, the US, mostly it was Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and other members of the Arab-led coalition that were dropping horrific numbers of bombs on Yemen, as well as blockading Yemen in many ways similar to what we're observing and what Israel has done to Gaza for many years. But Saudi Arabia was also using the notion that it needed to prevent weapons from getting to the Houthis, or Ansar Allah, as the movement prefers to be called. And using that justification to not allow in food and medicine and necessary basic items for the survival of Yemenis. And we're talking about, my understanding is Yemen's population at this time is about 41 million, 2/3 of whom live under the control of Ansar Allah. They control sort of the population centers of Yemen. And these were the areas that were being blockaded. And so you saw these horrific starvation of children, just awful sights coming out of Yemen, which then the positive side is that all of this, the Saudi Arabia essentially struck a deal with the Houthis, or agreed to a truce in April of 2022. And Yemen receded even further from the headlines than it had previously been. And then all that changed when, very soon after October 7th, Israel launches the assault on Gaza. By November of 2023, Ansar Allah announces that they are going to start blockading the port of Eilat, Israel's sole Red Sea port. And the Houthis, Ansar Allah controls the entrance to the Red Sea, and was going to attack ships trying to get there. And so what's in terms of thinking about the effect of what the Biden administration did in the year or so, because they launched Operation Prosperity Guardian in January of 2024, and then what Trump did in just the brief period in which the US was engaged in, again, well, in which Trump sort of took over the dropping bombs on Yemen. Um, so in the 12 months of US UK strikes under the Biden administration, 21 civilians were killed and 64 were injured. In contrast to that, in April alone, US airstrikes killed at least 206 people and injured 366. And 28 civilians had been killed in March. And then, luckily, in early May is when we saw Trump announce that he was, in fact, going to declare the ceasefire, unilateral ceasefire with the Houthis. Part of this has to do with the fact that the US was dropping huge amounts of ordnance on Yemen with very little effect. We saw in the fact that the Houthis were able to successfully hit near Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv, which really surprised people because it was a single missile that did get through not only the THAAD missile defense, but Israel's Arrow system. And because it was just a single missile, these systems ostensibly should have been able to block it, to shoot it out of the sky, and they were unable to do so. So clearly, the capacity of this group to strike Israel is growing. Just thinking about so people may remember the airstrikes by the United States on Yemen's Ras Isa oil port, that is civilian infrastructure, which killed at least 80 people, almost all civilians. US forces also struck a migrant detention center in Saada on April 28th, reportedly killing over 68 civilians and injuring dozens more. This was the same facility that Saudi Arabia had hit in 2022, which killed 66 people and injured many more. And at the time, Saudi Arabia's action drew significant condemnation, and then the US did the same thing. The 10 years of protracted conflict have pushed the country to the brink of economic collapse, shrinking the economy by more than half since the beginning of the conflict. Over 80% of the population live below the poverty line. 18.2 million people in Yemen are now in need of humanitarian assistance and protection services. 17.1 million Yemenis suffer from high levels of acute food insecurity, including 5 million people who are on the brink of famine. According to UNICEF, 1 in 2 children under the age of 5 are malnourished. And this has been going on for many years. And so you do see, unfortunately, the long-term effects of inadequate nutrition. So stunting and just the inability of these children to grow as they should be able to do. So just one final note. Obviously, I want to highlight the scope of what Trump was doing, which was far greater than what Biden did. But at the same time, I do think, and kind of similar to the quote that Isaac began with, of Trump calling out the failed US policies of interventionism in the Middle East and elsewhere, and highlight that Trump was willing to essentially declare victory and go home, to say, all right, we're not going to fire on the Houthis anymore. I have some doubts about the intended longevity of this ceasefire. It may really only be for the duration of this trip. He's in the Middle East. I hope it lasts longer, and that he realizes that, you know, if 7 years of bombardment by the Emiratis and the Saudis wasn't able to defeat the Houthis, and in many ways made them stronger by sort of galvanizing nationalism and giving them this external foe, that similarly the U.S. bombing the Houthis was not going to be able to successfully get them out. And one final note here, just to clarify, I mean, the Houthis have gained a lot of international recognition for being arguably the sole actor to sort of stand up on behalf of Gaza. But also keep in mind, I mean, they are a deeply patriarchal and they're very, very authoritarian group. Their goal is to reinstate in Yemen a system whereby descendants of the Prophet Muhammad have the right to rule. And this was a system that had ruled northern Yemen for 1,000 years and then was overthrown in the 1960s, and a more sort of merit-based system was established in Yemen. And the Houthis and others did not, they wanted things to go back to when they had privileges. So, as someone working on Yemen, I do sometimes find it challenging, because certainly there are many people who would dearly like to see the Houthis ousted. And I think from my perspective, my point is, well, I don't want the United States to be involved in dropping bombs on Yemen or anywhere. And it's really not something for the US government to be involved in. This is something that the Yemeni people need to be able to decide for themselves. And foreign intervention has just led to death and destruction. So as an American, I don't want my tax dollars being involved in bombing Yemen or regime change in Yemen. Although I do hope that perhaps in Yemen's future, it is possible for them to achieve a more representative, or not to call for democracy, but a form of government that best serves the Yemeni people. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Annelle. And before we transition to talking about the Constitution, could you just make sure, you may have already said this, but could you just make sure that everybody here understands why the Houthis or Ansar Allah, the government, de facto government for northern Yemen, why the government of northern Yemen has been basically firing into the Red Sea and firing at Israel, and why the United States was like the pretext for the bombing?
Yeah, so the Houthis declared soon after October 7th that they were going to try to blockade Israel's Red Sea port of Eilat. And the Biden administration responded by attacking the Houthis. The Houthis also fired on just international shipping in the Red Sea, including, people may remember, the ship Galaxy Leader, which they captured, the Houthis captured. However, in the context of the January ceasefire, the Houthis released that ship, and they declared that as long as Israel held up its end of the ceasefire in Gaza, they would no longer fire on any ships, that they would maintain a ceasefire as well. And they were upholding that until Israel started blocking aid again on March 2nd. And so it was on March 11th that the Houthis said, we're going to start firing at Israel again, because they are not upholding the ceasefire, some of the terms of which required aid. And they hadn't yet done any of that. And this was the Signal Gate scandal, for lack of a better word, that the United States, there was no imminent threat, and the Houthis had not yet engaged in any sort of renewed act of violence, but they had declared that they would. And so that was why in the Signal chat, you did have some representatives of people like J.D. Vance, as well as Joe Kent, who's in Tulsi Gabbard's staff, saying, we don't need to hit them now. There's nothing imminent. There's no threat to U.S. service members or like any reason to hit them now. And instead, you had Waltz and Hegseth, and then Stephen Miller saying, no, we should go ahead and bomb them now. Just reiterating the sort of lack of urgency, which means that they needed to have gone to Congress in order to be permitted to do something like this, because there was no imminent threat.
Thank you. And that's a really great segue to our next speaker, who is Bruce Fein. I really appreciate everything you just shared, Annelle, about the relevance of this conversation today, that just a week ago was that ceasefire, that truce. But a week ago, the U.S. was illegally, unconstitutionally bombing the poorest country in the Middle East. So thank you so much for that. We'll leave you up on the screen, and then as the speakers join in, we'll keep on adding you here. Bruce and I got to connect recently around the idea of trying to get some movement in Congress around this unconstitutional bombing of Yemen. That's why I'd reached out to Bruce. And one of the things that really struck me was Bruce's passion for the Constitution, and also for the way that the United States does foreign policy, and his deep understanding of history. My kind of the way I've been working on war powers and congressional war powers is about kind of looking at the last 10 years, or sometimes I think back to like learn about the 1973 War Powers Resolution. But Bruce has a much broader view of history, and just so glad to have you with us, Bruce.
No, thank you for the introduction. Um, I think that everything, all the tragedies and horrors that were just described, would not have happened, would not happen if the Constitution was functioning and the Declare War Clause was discharged by the Congress of the United States. It's natural that presidents would try to usurp power. It's not natural that Congress would give it away so irresponsibly, and leading us to presidential war after presidential war, which is exactly what the framers feared. But let me go back, I think, to paint a broader picture if we're going to find some, if you want to call it a solution, at least some diminishment of the penchant of the United States to go abroad in search of monster to destroy. Most recently, Afghanistan, 20 years, $2.3 trillion to get a worse version of the Taliban. There's no sanctions. There's no oversight. This is the worst expenditure of money in the history of the world. No one is sanctioned for having no clue as to what the reason we're in Afghanistan, violation of George Washington's farewell address, and a whole host of other doctrines of the United States that emerged from the Constitution. But if we start to think about war, it's the scourge of mankind from the beginning. It is species narcissism that prevents us from acknowledging that the human species is the most killer of all the species. They engage in warfare for the sake of warfare, just to dominate for the sake of domination. And it's characteristic from the very beginning that the institution that has the greatest incentive for concocting excuses for war is the executive branch. You need speed, you need unity of command, you need energy if you're going to run an empire, going to dominate. You can't have two generals in a war. And all history had taught the framers that if you want to stop war, you have to take the war power away from the executive. They saw that in Britain, the colonial power over the United States. You had the war powers entrusted to the monarch. It wasn't decided by Parliament, and Britain was engaged in warfare after warfare after warfare, because that's the executive branch tendency. It's the personality of the executive branch to fight, because it feels it gets the patriotism, it gets the footprints in the sand of time, you get monuments, you write history. You don't do that if you're a member of Congress and vote for war. None of that happens. You look at all the war memorials all over the world. Are they ever built for a legislator? Never. You know, got Napoleon, you got George Washington, you all got the executive branch heroes. And the uniqueness of the United States, and really was James Madison, said there's only one way that we're going to stop war. And the reason why war was number one concern is that war destroys liberty. To be candid, the real definition of war is to legalize first-degree murder. You can kill people even not in self-defense. So that's what really war is about. We don't try to define it that way. We have all sorts of euphemisms. You know, the armored knight is heroized in poems and romance and those sorts of things. But that's what war is. In times of war, there is no law. It goes back to Cicero made the same observation. So if you don't stop war, you don't have the rule of law. You don't have self-government. It's all the executive branch dictatorship, in fact. And we understand that even in our own period of time. With war, take World War II, it's supposed to be the greatest generation. Well, we made 120,000 mistakes in locking up Japanese Americans who are all loyal. We said them without any hearings, you know what, you're all going to engage in espionage and sabotage, and so you stick in these concentration camps. Right outside my office is a memorial to all those Japanese Americans who suffered. We finally made amends in the Civil Liberties Act in 1988 and paid reparations, but it really was minor compared to all the suffering that we inflicted. And that's just one instance. In all wars, the hysteria is unbelievable. World War I, we suppressed free speech, anybody who opposed the draft. Even Eugene Debs is sitting in prison while he's running for president. So it goes back to, how do you actually stop war? You're not going to stop war, even with Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Words don't do it. The horrors of war don't do it. The only way you stop war is entrust the decision to go to war to the legislative branch, Congress. The reason is because it's a talking shop, because it's transparent. There is no incentive for Congress to concoct excuses for war. They don't vote for war, no matter what the rhetoric is. In the history of the United States, 235 years, there's only been in 5 engagements has Congress ever declared war. And they were all in instances where Congress either believed falsely or there was, in fact, an attack on the United States, like Pearl Harbor. Even in World War I, there was a lie about the Lusitania. It actually had munitions, and so it was a legitimate target. But the American people were lied to by Woodrow Wilson. We said, oh, the Germans are engaged in illegal submarine warfare, and that got Congress to vote a declaration of war. In the other instances, the Mexican-American War, President James K. Polk lied about Mexico shooting an American soldier on American soil. And he, in fact, had a resolution in Congress declared the war unconstitutional because of the lie. The Spanish-American War, fueled by the phony claim that the Spanish had blown up the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, which would justify the war, which really wasn't about Cuba. We already got into the Philippines, suppressed self-determination by the Filipinos, then conquered Puerto Rico and Guam and on and on. But in these 5 engagements, Congress was acting in self-defense. In every single declaration, Congress declared we are already at war because we've been attacked. Never, ever has Congress taken the initiative and declared war when it hasn't believed that we were already into a state of war because another country had invaded the United States. Presidential wars, they proliferate like rabbits, Look around the world today. You go into Libya, we go into Somalia, we go into Syria, we go into Iraq, we go into Afghanistan, we go into Vietnam, go into Cambodia illegally. Yemen war is illegal. All of them are unconstitutional. It is unconstitutional for Congress to delegate to the president the war power. Flagrantly unconstitutional. Just as it was in the Supreme Court decision in Clinton versus New York, said you can't even delegate line item veto. And if we go back and think about the debate of the Declare War Clause, it explains why. The framers were unanimous. Nobody dissented from entrusting the war power exclusively to the Congress. James Madison said, it's the crown jewel of the Constitution. It was the wisest decision ever made by those who were in Philadelphia in 1787 drafting the Constitution. So they all understood as soon as you give the war power to the executive, there's going to be war permanently, as they observed all around the world. All history teaches the same lesson. And so the whole purpose of the Declare War Clause is defeated if you enable Congress to pass a resolution that says the president can go to war anytime he wants. It would be like Congress giving away the power of the purse by saying the president can spend money as he wishes and he can promulgate an internal revenue code. I mean, separation of powers is ended. Congress just said the president can assume all the legislative powers that are entrusted to Congress in Article 1 of the Constitution. So if we are ever going to get the United States back to civilized devotion to peace, you have to insist and remove from Congress anyone who permits these unconstitutional wars to continue and tell them you are not going to serve anymore. That's the only way you can get Congress to act. I have been up to Congress so many years, and I have a good friend, Thomas Massey of Kentucky, drafted resolutions. And he says, Bruce, discussing the Constitution with my constituents and members of Congress is like reading Shakespeare to cows. They don't care and they don't get it, right? It's a wonderful analogy. I said, you're exactly right, because they want to escape accountability. They want to hand it off to the president. Dianne Feinstein in the Senate once said, well, we don't want to vote on war. If it goes south, we just blame the president. We don't have to worry about it. And that's the total irresponsibility that the framers hoped to avoid by insisting that only the Congress could vote the war power. And the fact is that because the war power has been conceived by the U.S. Supreme Court as a political question, you can't get the Supreme Court in 235 years has never decided a war powers issue between Congress and the executive branch. So that is not going to be a safeguard. Congress and we the people are the only guardrail against perpetual presidential wars that say have proliferated at least since the turn of the century in the 1900s. This isn't discussed in American history, but you think about the time of the Spanish-American War, and I describe that is the moment, it's kind of like the inflection point where we decided we were not going to make liberty the glory of the United States. We cast a Faustian bargain. Let's replace the British as the empire. We'll dominate the world. Who cares about liberty? We'll go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. And that's what happened. And Congress acquiesced, but in some sense, the American people did too. They voted for these people. They keep returning them to Congress, and they know exactly what's going to happen. And if the United States is going to return to a system of, I call it invincible self-defense as our foreign policy, it's not because we expect the world to be perfect without our intervention. It's not, because we're dealing with human beings. It's the optimal solution. We influence abroad by example, but we fight and defend only to secure our own independence. And the reason is you cannot fight wars and preserve liberty. The definition of war is lawlessness. You get to say it's first-degree murder gets legalized. That's not the law. That is the law of the jungle. So if we ever expect to get back to having peace be our glory and liberty our lodestar, Congress has to recapture and assert its war power. And it's not going to do it by lectures. It's only when the American people make it clear you're getting voted out of office. You're abdicating your responsibility, which means a lot of education, because what I've said today is viewed as heresy. You know, in our lifetime, we've lived in an empire ever since I was born and before. I mean, and it's not a partisan issue. It's not Republican or Democrat. I'm quoting the words of Madeleine Albright, Secretary of State. Oh, we see broader than any other people in the world. We only fight angelic wars. So you have to trust us to do the right thing for you. I said, really? It was so nauseating, the arrogance of that statement. She's Democrat, but she echoes the same kind of nonsense that Republicans were echoing, during the domino theory. And it's not a partisan issue. It's because the whole culture has been imbibed with this idea of empire. Oh my God, if we're not the leader, then what's going to happen? Chicken Little, the sky is going to fall down. The domino theory, everywhere we're going to go. I mean, I remember in the 1950s, if Guatemala bought a few rifles from Czechoslovakia, that communist country, oh, all of Latin America was about ready to attack the United States. I mean, this is literal lunacy. The inflation of danger, 8 million fold. Does anybody really think if we're not fighting the Houthis, they're attacking the United States, they're an existential threat? It's absurd. Everything that you explain, and why are we even involved there? We are involved in the sense we're human beings and we don't relish suffering. But otherwise, this is contrary to the George Washington's farewell address, John Adams, Secretary of State. No, we influence abroad by example, and we hope people choose liberty or freedom. But if they don't, all we can do is make it worse. Because when we go and try to intervene, we sacrifice and destroy our own system. We become like the enemy. There's a very, very famous report called the Doolittle Report, prepared shortly after World War II under Eisenhower. And the gist of it was saying, we have to imitate the enemy, and we have to get the American people to swallow the horrible things that we're going to have to do. And we did do these horrible things. We used drugs and had people die because we thought we could overcome what we thought the ability of the communists to brainwash our people. And among other things that came after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I've spoken about that. Dwight Eisenhower and Admiral Lay told Harry Truman, you don't need to bomb. We already defeated the Japanese. And this was bombing the little children and women in civilian areas in Nagasaki and Hiroshima because we wanted to send the Soviet a message, you better comply with Yalta in Europe. Otherwise, see what a bomb we have. It didn't work anyway. But this was a war crime that staggers in comparison to all the other war crimes. Maybe you could even characterize it as genocide. But I want to go back to the fundamental point. We are never, ever going to tone down war without Congress exercising the war power. If that doesn't happen, we'll be at war forever. I thought one of the most terrible things in my lifetime really was what our reaction to 9/11 was. without having any declaration of war, we just kind of segued in to permanent war. Our architecture of law is now a permanent war architecture because we have said that enemy is international terrorism, and you can't sign a peace treaty with a tactic. So it means, and I can guarantee you, because you cannot diminish the risk of terrorism to zero, no one is ever going to stand up. Congress is not going to pass a resolution. The president's not going to say, oh, the war against international terrorism is over. So we live in a permanent warfare state. And that's why you have all these electronic surveillances and the Ed Snowden stuff. The right to privacy is out the window because they have to, in the words, or the Orwellian words of Michael Hayden, we really need to be worried about the not yet guilty. We got to spy on them. Not yet guilty. I mean, could you imagine? I mean, maybe Franz Kafka, needed some lessons on dramatizing the absurdity of the warfare state. The not yet guilty. I said, Michael Hayden, that's you. That's everybody. These concepts emerge. And that's after 9/11. And the Congress has not attempted to recapture its its war power. And it does work. The way in which the Vietnam War ended, and this comes after Congress repealed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, was Congress enacted an appropriation measure that's very simple. No monies of the United States can be expended to conduct combat operations in Indochina after April 15th, 1973. That was the end of the war. And when the North conquered the South in 75, Gerald Ford wanted to intervene again. He had no money. Congress would not appropriate any money. So that was the final treatise, I guess, on the Vietnam War, which is terrible in many, many respects, because it began with a big lie that there was a second torpedo attack in the Gulf of Tonkin that Lyndon Johnson used to convince Congress to pass what I believe an unconstitutional Gulf of Tonkin resolution, because it gave away the war power to the president. So how do you get Congress? How do you organize, this effort? It's not going to be a short-term effort because we've been living in this empire bubble for at least a century. But it's through education, teach-ins, programs like this, and you got to get the citizens to write in and say, listen, we don't want to be involved in these wars. Will it succeed? I think the track record is very, very positive. In 2013, President Barack Obama asked Congress to declare war against Syria based upon the alleged use of chemical weapons, which has some doubts about it. But anyway, that was the theory. The American people wrote in, I was there in the Congress, overwhelmingly, we're not getting in another war. And the effort to authorize the war failed completely. The bill didn't even get out of a committee. Unfortunately, President Obama just said, all right, I'll just go to war on my own. The same thing that President Bill Clinton did in the 1999 when he first asked Congress for a declaration of war against Serbia for the treatment of the Kosovar Albanians. Congress voted it down, and then Clinton said, well, I'll just call the bombing not war. The Chinese embassy suffered, as many others did as well. And so they moved forward with a war anyway. I had a friend, Thomas Campbell, who was in the Congress, brought a suit against Clinton called Campbell against Clinton, saying the war was unconstitutional. The court said you don't have any standing, so go back to Congress to try to get the money to be cut off. But that's not what the framers intended. The framers intended that we are at peace unless Congress declares war. Simple as that. Unless there's an actual attack on the United States like Pearl Harbor. So what this means, I believe, is a nationwide teach-in like the teach-ins in Vietnam, and get the American voters to say, listen, it's huge. It is your welfare at stake. We now have an annual military budget of over $1 trillion. The debt that we have incurred fighting these wars is now having carrying cost of over $1 trillion. Well over half of all discretionary spending goes to the military because we have 800 bases abroad, and now we have space commands. And pretty soon I will probably, with Elon Musk, want to have a command center in Mars, to make sure that the Martians are not endangering safety of the United States. And if we aren't willing as citizens to be active like that, forget it. All the words, all the lobbying is never, ever going to stop a president from going to war. Whether it's Trump, whether it's Obama, whether it's Biden, they continue on and on and on. So that's my pitch. And I encourage everyone to stay with the course. it's always eager. I mean, you always want to have something happen the next day. But politics, especially in a situation like this, where we build up this empire bubble for a century, it's not going to change overnight. Even if we spend 24 hours a day and don't see immediate result, it has to start someplace, even if the ones who get the credit are not even born yet. I mean, like Obama, he gets the credit for all the blacks who suffered lynchings and whatever, after Reconstruction and Jim Crow. He gets the president. Well, look at all the people who suffered far more than he, including Frederick Douglass, didn't. But that's just the price you pay because history is kind of flukish on that score. So even if we get no credit, we have to start the ball rolling and just accept how history unfolds. And many other respects, the credit, sometimes is given to the wrong people.
Thank you so much, Bruce. Really appreciate your historical perspective and your big picture and your thoughts around war and the role of the American people and Congress. We're going to now hear from Diego Rivera, who is one of the people who's been working tirelessly in states all over the country um, on issues having to do with war. And I got to interview Diego on my radio show that I had last year, and really appreciated the chance to connect with someone who comes at this from a different perspective, not around, I think we had a conversation, Diego, where you were saying, we kind of agree that I was looking at the U.S. as starving children, bombing people into starvation around the world. You're looking at protecting the lives of members of the United States Armed Services and not sending people into harm's way without a declaration of war. But at the end of the day, we were looking for similar and agreeing on similar policies, and that's just, I think that's exciting. It speaks to what Bruce was speaking about in terms of the American people taking action, and this being depending on us making our will known, and taking action at the ballot box, but also in between the elections as well. So, Diego, the floor is yours. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Well, first, let me just say yes and amen to everything I heard. I mean, right? I also sometimes feel like the psalmist just wants to rip his heart out of his chest every time we talk about what's happening all across the globe and what we do. And I agree with everything. Now, I'm not going to quote John Quincy Adams, but I am going to quote a comic. And I think he actually said it best. So Dave Smith is a comic, and he said, what republic do you know that turns into an empire, who exhausts itself militarily and financially, whose society starts to decay, and then everything turns out all right? So that's a real concern of mine. And like I said, yes and amen to everything that we've said here. But I want to give a white pill to people. You know what I mean? Like, hey, it's not all doom and gloom. I focus on a legislation called the Defend the Guard legislation. And, Bruce brought up Thomas Massie. And Thomas Massie is a big supporter of this legislation. And I think Thomas Massie's right. It would be the educational model. That doesn't mean we don't educate people, but the idea that we're just going to educate these people in DC to do the right thing, well, that might be a fool's errand. And so what we do is we say that without a formal declaration of war, right, that's articulated in the Constitution, that the state's National Guard will not send their troops into active overseas combat. Simply put, you can't take our blood and treasure unless you declare war, right? And so we've got this bill filed in 30 states. We've made movement here. Now in Arizona, we've made it through both chambers. And I think probably we'll get to the governor's desk. It'll be a fight from there. Places like in Texas, with the GOP audience, we put a ballot in. Not only is this a part of the GOP plank in 7 states, but here the ballot initiative 6 got 84% of the vote. It actually got 60,000 more votes than Trump here in Texas during the primaries. The correlating no votes were with the Nikki Haley votes here in Texas. So the grassroots want this. And I don't put my hope and trust in that DC is going to do the right thing. And I think that sometimes when you look at it, like, how am I going to move this Leviathan? So again, the states created this monster. So it's going to have to be the states that yank its chain, right? And so what we're doing is we're using a decentralization tactic to try to rein in some of this stuff. Now, this is a bill that's a Rorschach test for wherever you are on the spectrum. And frankly, I don't care. Because what this is we're just saying, unless you first declare war, you're not going to take our blood and treasure. And I know that this bill is having an effect because every time we go to committee, we have generals, we have JAG officers, non-government organizations who come up to testify against it. They'll make threats of what are we going to do? We'll get nuked, federal funding, all this stuff. These are empty and illegal threats that they're not willing to carry out for many reasons that I don't have to articulate here. What I do want to do is actually give you a white pill that there's stuff that you can do. Yes, I understand that if you're trying to change the minds of 535 people in DC, 435, doesn't matter. 187, I don't know, it doesn't really matter. Um, it's very easy to get doom pilled. And so what we're doing here is we're focusing on radical decentralization. This is somewhere where you can still look at your state rep in the face, where you don't need millions and millions of dollars in order to just get one person elected. And we can see like people like Thomas Massey. I'm glad he's there. He's the canary in the coal mine, but at the same time, he's a lonely man in Washington. And that's honestly why I think that we have support from people like Massey, people like Paul Gosar who work in appropriations, have also come out in support of this. Ron Paul, Rand Paul, um, Tim Sheehy, and other members, and that's fine. I'll take their endorsements. But here's the thing: we've filed it in 30 states. We've moved it through several chambers. New Hampshire just passed it out of the House last session, and so we're moving. And so the good part is we have generals show up in their uniforms to testify, to make threats, and all of this stuff. But with our grassroots organization, bottom line is that for a lot of these guys, the politician is not a mysterious creature. Um, they go to they essentially they just bend to wherever the greatest will is. And so the problem is that we focus on these things, but we never apply pressure to these people to normally the pushback that they get, or I'll just say it like this. If the politician's gonna by default will vote in the way that the generals and the NGOs tell them how to vote, unless the grassroots is there. And that's because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how mad the general is at the politician, it will be the people and a large group of angry voters that stops that man from sitting in his chair. So while he's sitting in a committee or while he's voting on the floor, he still has to weigh the fact that he might not actually be there. And no, I don't think that we can do this in DC. I've also wasted my time trying to uh, you know, I've also gone down and done citizen lobbying with hundreds of veterans to talk to senators and congressmen. And I had the chief staffer for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and be like, there's no political will for what you want. And yeah, that's true. But this is at the local level and we're winning. And I'll give you, sadly, the bad part is that for some people here on this call is that a lot of the times it's been the Democrats that have voted against this where it dies. I'll give you an example. In Montana, we had 41 votes. Only 5 of them were Democrats. There were still another, like probably 26 other Democrats that could have voted for this and gotten through the Montana House. Um, Most times at best, there might be 1 or 2 Democrats that vote for this legislation. In blue states, it's not even filed. So if essentially we can get people to apply grassroots pressure um, to say this is a bill that we want and to move it forward, we can do this. But these bills aren't even up for consideration. They haven't been filed in states like California, New York, New Jersey. So this is somewhere where we can actually do this. Now, here's why it matters, and I think it has greater consequences too. Aside from the fact that these generals are trying to fight us, um, you have to look at these statistics, and I brought it up a little bit before this and all this stuff. But during the height of the occupational forces, during the surge, 45% of the occupational forces were National Guardsmen. What started off in Syria with 3% of National Guardsmen ended up with 58% of the occupational forces being National Guard. But what happens when you take 58% of their occupational forces away? Well, they get real mad. So my friend Scott Horton, who wrote this book, Provoked, Enough Already, Fool's Errand, he was testifying in Maine one time for this bill, and he just kind of put it out straightforward and said, like, look, if a bill like this had already been in place, we wouldn't have been able to go to Iraq. We wouldn't have been able to go to these places because we're using a model here that says you can't take our blood and treasure. And you're not going to be able to do it without our National Guard. And they're not. Because again, this goes back to the fact that the Republic has turned into an empire, it's exhausted itself militarily and financially, and it's decaying. And they rely heavily on our National Guard. And not only that, but it's very heavy on using and abusing these guys too, as well. So there's a lot of aspects to this, but simply put, even just asking for accountability is enough to drive them crazy. And I think that one, I can be honest with you, I would love the Democrats to get on board, but frankly, I don't care. Because what I do is I'm a grassroots director, and what I like to do is win. And we're going to get this bill passed, and we're going to check and poke the bear. We can do this with Democrats' help or without. I would love that. But this is probably the only way that I know that we can use localization of power or radical decentralization to just tell DC, I don't care what you do. And again, it's not a silver bullet, but it is a step in the right direction that says, hey, how about I just take 50% of your occupational forces and just say you're not taking them? How's that sound? Like, go ahead. But you're not, we're taking away 50% of what you're able to use. I know this for a fact. They hate it. They will spend days and weeks at the Capitol lobbying against it. But if I can mobilize the grassroots to put pressure on politicians, we still pass. We get out of committees. We go through the floor. We get passed. We move to the next chamber. And it's been a fight, and it will be a fight, and it's a knockout, drag out fight. And we've kind of been doing this with one hand tied behind our back because we haven't had, let's say, a lot of support from our brethren on the other side. And I'd love that. But the white pill here is we're going to get it passed. It's going to happen. And this will be like a domino effect. Is that as soon as this happens, other states, they're all playing chicken with each other. They're simultaneously going like, oh, am I going to be first? Oh, I don't know. And then some of them are saying, I want to be first. And they're clawing and scratching to try to be the first state that passes Defend the Guard legislation in this country and just tells DC we ain't doing it. So I hope that that gives you a little bit of hope. We are going to get this passed. We have the right people, and we're applying the grassroots to do this. We're taking a little bit of a different method, but I don't know, probably most people haven't considered here localizing power in order to poke the bear and just say, you're not taking our guys. Again, not a silver bullet, but what do? Just yell at the wall, give them more copies of Smedley Butler, and just hope that all of a sudden that, their hearts, aren't hardened and they're softened, and all of a sudden they're just a new creature and they all of a sudden get it. Yeah. Don't hold your breath. But there is something that we can do. And so any help would definitely be of use. And I'm happy to take any help because, again, it is a knockout, drag out fight. But it's worth it because we are going to win.
Thanks so much, Diego. I so appreciate the hope and determination that you bring to this conversation and the strategic way that you've been engaging politicians. And through your members and through everyday people across this country. It's super inspiring to me about what you've been able to move through state legislators. And we've been really glad to support your work in Texas with reaching out to our list of people there and look forward to continuing to collaborate however we can. We have also at Action Course seen the same thing that you were talking about, Diego, with being able to move politicians at the national level. It's exciting to hear about what you're doing in the States because that's so much closer, in some ways easier to reach your state representative or state senator than the national politicians. But we've seen those tactics that you've described, some of our calls working with at the national level as well, in terms of demonstrations in front of congressional offices. I mean, talking to Senate Majority Leader's office a while ago, in U.S. Senate, I'm talking about, and we said, hey, we're going to put out a statement. People are going to be demonstrating in front of your offices with a hashtag um, about famine and your boss's name. Um, we would really rather do this the easier way, and you could just put out a statement about constitutional war powers and opposing U.S. bombing of Yemen, and they did. So, these tactics, whether they're a state legislator or a federal legislator, they can work. And I would think what Diego said about that it's that point that we have more power than we probably realize, but we have to use it. So I want to actually, on that note, go into an action. We're going to have a moment to take some action. Before we do that, I want to clarify that Action Corps is a nonpartisan project. We don't endorse or oppose any candidate for office. Any views that might be expressed on this call by speakers or participants about any particular candidate or party don't reflect Action Corps, as we are strictly nonpartisan. We are going to pass the mic to Sarah, who has prepared an action opportunity for folks who would like to take that. We invite you to join us with this. We'll take a few moments to do this action opportunity, and then we're going to go back to a couple of the questions that were raised in the chat. And thank you, everyone who just took some action. Really appreciate that. I find hope in action, and taking it with people together is great. I am going to now share in the chat some of the questions that we got, that some folks submitted before this event, and then also ones that were just submitted in the chat. I know I didn't catch them all, but thought this would be a good starting place for our speakers. And if there are any that you would particularly like to answer, you can go for that one. But I thought we could start with this question, and I will work on spotlighting you all as soon as I finish answering this, which is how to increase cooperation between anti-war conservatives or libertarians and progressives. There was reference to Quincy Institute doing some of that, and as does Action Corps, like we're doing right now. But interested to hear more people's thoughts on how you do that.
I think you don't have those divisions. It seems to me all you have unity behind following the Constitution of the United States. It's about process, and the process that works and keeping us out of war unless Congress declares it because we've been attacked or there's an actual danger. I don't think it's a matter of progressives, liberals, conservatives, or otherwise. We all live under the same Constitution. It means the same thing no matter what your political persuasion is. And the fact is, we've just we're permitted the Constitution to be ablaze, and no one is saying anything. Annelle, we talked briefly about the signal, blunder of Hegseth, but the real scandal wasn't they weren't in a skiff. How did we get to war at the Houthis? Really? Now, and to show you how far gone it is, when Tulsi Gabbard was in Congress, I worked with her. I drafted a resolution that she introduced. It's called HR 111. It made it an impeachable offense for a president to initiate a presidential war. She's sitting there on the conversation. She doesn't say, how did we get to war with the Houthis? She's already inside the bubble. And she was the best you could get after Walter Jones, who I worked with him also to get these resolutions passed. But this should not be a partisan issue. The Constitution is not partisan. It's for all of us. It's really our deliverance from the law of the jungle. And it shouldn't be, everybody should, we're in one sense, we're all, in the eyes of the Constitution, we're all Americans. That's it. We don't make any other classifications. And that's how we have to address this issue. It's not political maneuvering for one side or the other. It's the savior of the country for self-government and the Declaration of Independence principles.
Thank you for that, Bruce. Anybody else want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree with Bruce's point about the Constitution, but I also I thought his comment about talking about the Constitution is like reading Shakespeare to cows. And that seems to come up in this question of, we're seeing a genocide unfolding before our very eyes. Isn't that stronger than something about a piece of paper from 200 years ago? And I do think that is probably the case, that for many people observing the horrors of what's happening in Gaza and as well as in Yemen, although much less comes out of Yemen, that is much more motivating than necessarily, reckoning with the fact that maybe none of us got quite enough constitution in our education. But to get to some of this question about of how to increase cooperation between anti-war conservatives, libertarians, and progressives, I in working at the Quincy Institute, it has sometimes been a little bit of a challenge because sometimes it does require reaching out to or cooperating with people who hold views that I otherwise disagree strongly with or even consider abhorrent. But I do think that the overarching mission is more important, trying to reduce US militarism, trying to reduce unnecessary spending that goes to the Pentagon when it should be going to helping Americans that need it to survive. Um, and so for me, it has certainly been learning how to work with those who I otherwise disagree with on other issues. And part of why I think this is important is it's not only about trying to prevent wars or trying to build coalitions on this particular issue that I do think is extremely important, but it also speaks to polarization in our country and the fact that so many of us don't necessarily have conversations with people who have different political views. There is a tendency, especially with social media, if someone disagrees with you, you don't engage with them, you don't follow them, you might block them. That sort of this idea that if there's disagreement there, it's not worth trying to get past it or trying to work with someone, even if you disagree with them on one issue. And just for the future of the United States of America, and to try to avoid a situation where we do become so polarized that we are looking at something like another civil war, which I fear could be the outcome. I, I I think that the kind of work that Quincy does and that many other organizations do to try to work on this issue as well as other issues, to try to reach out across those political barriers and boundaries is is hugely important. And a lot of that also just starts with people in our own lives, people who you disagree with politically, um, and trying to have conversations there instead of just saying, well, I guess we're just going to avoid that topic or I'm not going to engage with this person anymore.
Let me
Thank you.
just offer, I think that these ideas, the concepts are not academic. The whole idea of due process, you could say, is academic, but due process is the heart of civilization. I understand it takes a minimal amount of education to know its importance. We see that now with people getting deported without any due process. They end up with dungeons in El Salvador. And so it talks about, well, you need to get better educated in the Constitution as though it's kind of removed from real life. It's not. It's daily in front of us. And that's why I believe, the educational mission is so critical if we are going to survive. Otherwise, we're going to do what all other empires do: collapse by overreach and trying to dominate the entire world. And the whole idea of separation of powers in the Constitution is to get a consensus on process. So as long as we follow the law and the process, even though we're going to get it wrong, O.J. Simpson gets off with due process. Everyone understands that he probably killed, his girlfriend. But we stick with the process, even if it's imperfect, because it's better than all the other alternatives. And I say this because you cannot improve on Jesus' Sermon on the Mount if you want to encourage people to do the right thing, turn the other cheek, and don't go to war. And where Jesus delivered that sermon is the most bloodstained place on the history of the world. It's not because Jesus was bad. It's that you're dealing with a species that, unless you entrust the war power to Congress, it's going to go to war, no matter who is the president. And that's what we're witnessing time after time after time. Republican, Democrat, it's the same old, same old. And that's why it's so critical. We keep insisting we need to kick people out of Congress if they don't do their job. That's what our deliverance is.
Thank you, Bruce, for your passion on that one. Diego, anything you want to add? And then I want to go back to the question that Annelle's father summarize and Annelle's respond to in the chat. But Diego, first for you, anything about uh, left and right working together on stopping wars? I think you need to unmute there.
I'm gonna try that. I said some really brilliant stuff, so if that didn't come across, that's because it was muted, but just imagine I said some really great stuff. Let me try to say this in a way that makes sense to the people here. Often when I talk to libertarians or when I'm talking to people, I want to, um, yes, of course, always break bread, but I want to identify with who people say that they are. So if I talk to a libertarian and they tell me that they think that the government is a monopoly on violence, and they think that war is mass murder, and they think that the draft is conscription, and they say that, given all of these things, our big enemy is the government and we hate war. And I'm just giving the libertarians as an example so that you can expand this out to wherever on the spectrum it is that you feel like you're talking to people, is that one, come to them from a position that they themselves hold, not from a position that you hold that's completely antithetical to it. So when I talk to them and I say, I need your help to make phone calls because we're moving this bill. Now, you say you hate war. You say you hate the government because it's a monopoly on violence. You say they've shredded the Constitution, right? But can I ask you to make 20 phone calls tomorrow? Collectively? Can you take 5 minutes out of your day to do this? Can you do that? And if you can't, then I don't care because it doesn't really matter how right you are. If you say that this government is abusive, that it's mass murdering people, and yet you can't be bothered to take 10 minutes out of your day and there's always an excuse, it doesn't matter really how right you are. I'd rather get someone who's kind of sort of getting it and kind of sort of learning that wants to do something over someone that's just going to be right and never shows up. So it's like at this point, I want to talk to people from an identity that they themselves hold, not one that I hold or I don't straw man their view. I use their view. So if you tell me you really do hate war because it's mass murder, you hate what the military industrial complex is doing, but then I ask you for 5 to 10 minutes of your day to make phone calls to some state reps and you tell me you can't over and over, I don't really care what your position is. Do work. That's really what it is. And I think, one, sincerity, but also address people from where they're coming from and then also hold people accountable. Don't like it. This isn't a debate club. I'm not trying to debate on the marginal tax rates or anything. I don't really care. You know why? Because I want to bring my brothers home, not in a box. And so if you hold that as an actual like priority and we can triage this and say, you know what I'd like to do? Stop mass murder. I'd like to bring the boys home alive. We can get a lot of stuff accomplished. So just one, hold people accountable, and then don't use an identity that people don't hold to talk to them. It would be crazy. So just start from that position. I think that that's probably what helps best because the reality is I don't care what your political position is. I'm trying to bring the boys home. You want to debate? Go join a book club. I'm not here for that.
Thanks, Diego.
Yeah, that's why Aristotle said that courage is the apex of virtues, because without courage, no other virtue is possible, and that's what we need to inculcate in the culture.
Annelle, we promise you the next question about the one your dad had.
Um,
And I can
um,
repeat it if it's helpful. Sorry.
yeah, this was about is it more about the politicians or the fact that they're captured by interest? Yeah, I mean, as I said in the chat, I mean, campaign finance reform is something that pretty much everyone should be pushing for, no matter what your main issue is, given the degree to which members of Congress and other politicians are captured by various lobbying groups. Um, that I think another truly important question was one about this question of, well, if Congress uses its war powers to authorize more war, why have, like, well, then okay, Congress has authorized it, but which is a very important question. But I think my understanding, and Bruce and Diego could offer their perspective as well, is the point is that keeps it as part of the democratic process, that constituents could then call their representative and say, all right, there's a vote coming up on whether or not to authorize war with Iran, for example. I don't want us going to war with Iran. I don't want, the National Guard side. I don't want anyone sent to war with Iran or whatever it is. In contrast to that, the executive branch has acted unilaterally, engaging in wars. There hasn't been an authorized war since World War II. So even the authorization for the use of military force that Congress did vote on in 2001, that was not a declaration of war. And the subsequent one in 2001 and 2002, both of these, neither of them officially declared war. And again, Bruce may have more thoughts on that. But again, it is an excellent question because you may be in a situation where Congress does vote to authorize war. However, at least it would be Congress asserting its constitutional war making authority, and it would offer citizens the opportunity to weigh in. So it doesn't eradicate war, but at least it gives people the opportunity to push back.
Congress will not, they won't go to war and vote on it. Say they've only voted on it when we thought we've been attacked. I remember, again, working with Walter Jones. This was a time that Obama was going into Syria unilaterally because he couldn't get a declaration of war. And Walter Jones approached the House Speaker, and he said he wanted a vote, at least in Congress, on whether there's going to be a declaration of war in Syria. He said, "This is my constitutional responsibility." And the speaker said, "No, we're not going to do a vote because we'd lose the vote. So therefore, we won't vote on it." Whatever their rhetoric is, and approved again in 2013 when Obama asked for a declaration of war against Syria, he couldn't get it. When Clinton asked for a declaration of war against Serbia, he couldn't get it. They won't vote for declarations of war. It's because the institutional personality. Harry Truman in the Korean War didn't go to Congress and try to get a declaration of war because he would lose. No president is going to bypass seeking a declaration if they think they can get it, because it then shares responsibility if the war goes south. The reason why they don't ask for the declaration is because they know they can't get it, but they want to fight the wars anyway. So it's just theoretically, yeah, Congress could vote authorize wars that we perhaps would oppose. But if you look at 235 years of history, they have never, ever done it. And when you get what I consider the war hawks, like Ted Cruz and Tom Cotton saying, "No way are we voting for war," whatever they say otherwise, they aren't going to do it. That's how you keep us at peace. And it worked for 100 years till we decided we would rather be an empire and let the president decide on war.
What I hear is that there's choice here. We may forget that as the American people we have a choice, but there is choice. That our U.S. foreign policy hasn't always been like this, and it doesn't have to be like this, and it can be different. And what I heard you talking about, Diego, was that commitment about how that finding what it is that people believe and giving them an opportunity to take an action that aligns with that belief. And this evening, we've provided an opportunity for us to hear each other from different political perspectives, from different priorities about maybe what's most important to us, whether it's human rights or the Constitution or state rights or defending the National Guard or um, preventing the U.S. from starving people and bombing people around the world. But at the end of the day, we can find common ground in advancing policies that actually benefit people and that are in line with the Constitution. I would like to just give a moment to Diego and then to Annelle if there's anything else you wanted to add before we wrap up. And maybe like 1 minute each.
Is this just wrap up for good? Is that what we're doing?
Yeah, and then we're gonna wrap up for good. And actually, Bruce, if there's any final things you want to say too, we'll make sure you get a final word in there as well. So 1 minute for each of you, and then we're going to, for folks who want to stay on and are up for doing a screenshot, we'll take a group photo that we can put out along with a message about ending endless war and Congress reclaiming their power. So, Diego, why don't you go ahead, and then Annelle, and then Bruce.
Yeah, I guess what I would say to you guys is that it's very important to be educated, but it doesn't matter if you're right if you won't actually do anything for it. I hate to say this, but in reality is we probably, some of you here probably hold different political views from you. You know what I do? I don't argue with people online. I just go beat them politically. And so if you really have a problem with a lot of these people, just shut up and go do something. That's really the thing. You have to be educated. Yes. Yes and amen. I agree with all that. And I'm willing to work with anybody to bring these boys back home alive. But you know what I don't have a super abundance of? It's people that are willing to roll up their sleeves and do some grassroots activism because that will do it. Now, this is a different way to do this. We're doing radical decentralization. And boy, I can promise you, we're pissing off the military industrial complex in a very real way. If you don't believe it, go to Bring Our Troops Home, go to the YouTube, check out any of the committee hearings. You will find generals, JAG officers, NGOs constantly storming the Capitol, making threats that we're going to get nuked, that they're going to kill our puppies, that we might die, our funding will get stripped, and it's still passing. You know why? Because there's at least enough resilient people that said we don't care and we don't buy it anymore. So what I would encourage you to do is don't just be right, but actually go out and do something. So you can get a hold of me. I'm happy to reach out to you. What we'll do is we'll find a bill sponsor. We'll figure out where it's at in committees. We'll move it forward in committees, look at the whip list, move it forward, get it through the floor, get it to the next chamber, and we will have this knockout, drag out fight. And I'll do it with you. But I am going to ask for your, so please, thank you.
Thank you, Diego. And over to you, Annelle.
Amen, Diego. I wanted to respond this question of why didn't more people leave? Um, I mean, unfortunately, power is a hell of a drug, and a lot of people, whether they're inside the State Department or elsewhere in the US government, feel they have a fair amount of power. That being said, I also recognize it is difficult to not have a job in this country. And there were many people who encouraged me to go public with the resignation because I wasn't planning to go public. And it was colleagues inside state that said, please go public because I can't, I'm not able to quit my job right now. But if you'd be willing to go public, please do. Um, I think, you know, there was one other question. Oh, how to use war powers to cut off weapons to Israel. I mean, the Congress successfully successfully passed a joint resolution of disapproval on weapons sales to Saudi Arabia in the context of the war on Yemen. Trump vetoed it, but then we did see a significant decrease in the airstrikes that Saudi Arabia was conducting because the Saudis knew that they might lose US funding. And this was in the link that I shared where you can see over time the Saudi-led coalition airstrikes in Yemen from 2015 to 2022. So there's a path there for trying to cut off weapons through the JRD process, as well as a war powers resolution, which would be a different congressional path. But again, I think sometimes even just the threat that the U.S. would no longer be involved in sponsoring this violence can make actors, whether it's Saudi Arabia or Israel, rethink some of the decisions they're making.
Thank you so much, Annelle. And I just put the link to your op-ed in CNN published about why you quit the State Department in the chat for folks who would like to read that. And Bruce, we have 30 seconds for you. Sorry.
I actually have a lawsuit on behalf of some in Gaza and the West Bank, cutting off the military shipments because of violation of the Leahy Amendment that prohibits military equipment to units of foreign governments that have engaged in gross violations of human rights, which includes genocide. I just want to leave with a reminder that we're here, all the audience, because among other things, on July 4, 1776, 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence signed their own death warrants. They said they're risking their life, fortune, sacred honor, none of it was anonymous, in order to advance these unalienable rights, which was earthquake in the history of civilization. We are not going to be minions and serfs to monarchs or otherwise. We need to take inspiration from those risks and sacrifices. Not all of them died, some did. Not all of them were harmed, but some were robbed and their families and their finances destroyed. We cannot afford summer soldiers and sunshine patriots in this cause. And that's, I think Diego is an inspiration on the ground. I work on every day. I live within walking distance of the Congress. And it doesn't matter whether the probability of success are high or low. If it's the right thing to do it.
Thank you. And with that, we're going to close our recorded part of this program.